Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Princeton Public Library. My name is Nora. I'm part of the programming team, and we are thrilled to have Libby Copeland with us today to talk about her recent book, The Lost Family. A little bit of logistics. We have the chat open at the moment, which we encourage you to use. We have posted in there information on how you can purchase Libby's book, and we will be adding that information back at the end of the program so that you can access that. If you have any questions during the program that you'd like to have us ask Libby, we encourage you to put them in the Ask a Question box, which is directly below your screen. You can add those questions at the end or at any point during the talk if a question comes to you. If you see someone else post a question that you would also like to see answered, you can upvote it to make sure that it comes to our attention. So please do ask those questions. This event is being recorded, and the recording will be available for on-demand viewing immediately following the event, so please feel free to share it if you know anyone else who may be interested in watching this. So anyone who has done really any thinking about their own personal history or their family's story has considered the idea of decisions and actions by an astonishing number of individuals have led to you being here now in this moment in these circumstances. But in some cases, DNA testing can tweak or entirely rewrite what we know about that story. What does that mean to our understanding of ourselves? So, Libby Copeland is an award-winning journalist who has written for The Washington Post, New York Magazine, New York Times, The Atlantic, and many other publications. She specializes in the intersection of science and culture. She was a reporter and editor at The Post for 11 years, has been a media fellow and guest lecturer, and has made numerous appearances on television and radio. Her book, The Lost Family, explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. The Wall Street Journal said it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times said, which I enjoy, before you spit in that vial, read this book. And the Washington Post said The Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? So I'm going to bring Libby up on screen and we will explore these questions. Hello, Libby.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here and happy to be with everyone who's here. Hi, everyone.
Thanks for joining us. We are very excited to have you. I know our population at the library is really fascinated by genealogy, local family history, and the question of DNA. So I am excited to talk to you further. Can you give us a little background just on your own genealogy journey? Is that something that you had done for a long time personally for your family?
So, my family had been more or less interested in genealogy, my dad in particular, going back to the 80s. And he was doing genealogy back in like the bad old days before the internet. So that meant writing letters to clerks in courthouses down in Tennessee, trying to get files. And then the National Geographic Genographic Project came along, which was DNA testing that looked at your ancient migration path. And my family tested, some members of my family tested back then. And then again, when the type of DNA testing that's now so popular, which is known as autosomal DNA testing, both my parents tested. And then my dad gifted me a kit. And it sort of sat there for a little while because I knew it was a rabbit hole. I knew my tendency to be an obsessive researcher, and I was frightened of that in myself. I had little kids and I thought I don't have time. And this box was kind of sitting there in the kitchen for quite a while. And this was late 2016, early 2017. And I started to talk to my editor at the Washington Post about the possibility of writing about DNA testing. And I thought, all right, well, this kit's got to be put to use. Let me test. And what's interesting is that in the years since I started writing first an article for the Washington Post and then my book, The Lost Family, my interest and dedication to genealogy and DNA and genetic genealogy, which is what it's known as when you kind of work with the DNA in addition to the paper records, has kind of grown parallel to my professional research and our family's understanding of its roots, which are varied from all over. Has really grown. And now I feel like deeply knowledgeable. And I feel like I understand, because of my personal investment in it, this fascinating moment we're in where Americans are really, really into genealogical inquiry. It's like a huge business. It's a deeply kind of intimate journey for a lot of Americans. It says a lot about this particular moment we're in, that we're really into this pre-pandemic, but also there's something about the pandemic that I think has made us turn to it more than ever. And I think there's a great deal we can learn about ourselves from looking at the past. So the process of understanding all that, I feel like I joined this nation of seekers. That's kind of the term I use for people who are trying to understand their present better by understanding history. And so my book is in many ways a kind of a look at a nation, a nation of American seekers, and sort of how we got here and where we are. In terms of how that impacts our personal narratives and where we're going.
Awesome. It's you mentioned being gifted that DNA test. It's so funny that the home DNA testing, it's often presented as like a recreational activity, something that might reveal, maybe a fun bit of family trivia, but it can also be, something that, it's a profoundly revealing catalyst. Your book kind of explores this dichotomy. Is there a way to be ready for anything when you enter DNA testing?
That's a great question. I think that the companies do, a reasonably okay job of alerting you to the possibility that you might be getting something you don't expect when you take a DNA test. And yet there's literally no way to prepare anyone. And what I was particularly interested in addition to the kind of looking at this moment in genealogy, this moment in genealogical inquiry, was the significant subset of people who get a surprise in their DNA results that upends their understanding of themselves, of their families, of the past, and their understanding of the truth. The things that can be discovered through DNA, they can be very dramatic, but they can also be really kind of existential questions. And that was what was interesting to me, the family dynamics, how those are altered, how I think that alters us in terms of us as a culture, right? We are grappling with all the things in the past that we were never told. We're grappling with the taboos and the stigmas of the past. We're grappling with the intersection and the collision between my right to know who I am and your right to maintain your own privacy, if you're my mother, for instance, right? So we're struggling with all of that. But the personal narrative, the alterations to our understanding of ourselves, that to me is absolutely the most fascinating, right? Because when you grow up and you're 55 years old and you believe that that your father is your genetic father, and all of a sudden you discover that he isn't, it invites all these questions about selfhood, about memory, about childhood, right? Discovering that your beginnings are different from what you thought they were alters everything else. It alters the trajectory of your story. We all have a story, which is sort of how we, identify ourselves, or we get through life relating to other people, telling our personal narratives. And those narratives are irrevocably altered by the revelations of surprising genetic identity that is contained in these DNA test kits. So no, I mean, you can't ever really prepare someone for something like that. And I've talked to literally hundreds of people, right, who took a DNA test and found that it changed them in some fundamental way. And, they almost always said, yeah, I saw that little advisory when I tested at Ancestry or when I tested at 23andMe. And I saw that it said you would discover unexpected relatives, but I didn't think it would apply to me. And why would you, right? Because even if you know that there's a statistical possibility, and there is, right, there's a statistical possibility within a population that, for instance, you're going to discover you're not related to dad. you just would never assume that you were going to be one of those statistics, because it would it would require a kind of cognitive distortion. We assume we know what there is to know, and then we are very, very surprised. And that is a growing cohort of Americans who are in this moment sort of struggling with all sorts of questions that are psychological, emotional, and also go to the heart of how they construct their own identities.
It's a fascinating question, and in your book, you have a lot of really amazing examples of people whose results led them in all sorts of directions. Alice is sort of the main through line. Her story is incredible. I will not spoil it because everyone should read it and discover for themselves, because she has really this incredible journey of research and discovery, and she's like a stats woman and a data woman. It's so cool. But so without spoiling, you have her as your case, kind of your main case study. Can you talk about kind of her, like how her quest was like such a great example of what you were talking about, of how these surprises can impact?
Yeah. So the Washington Post in its review said it's like an Agatha Christie mystery. The Alice is the Agatha Christie character. She is the Poirot. She is fascinating for a number of reasons. Her personality, her interest in technology, her doggedness, and then the particular contours of her specific story are just absolutely compelling. And I knew I was writing a book of science, but for a mainstream audience. And I knew the possibility of getting, too bogged down in the technical. So I really wanted to make it reader friendly for people like me who do not have a PhD in genetics. And I wanted to make it a page turner. My focus in the book, it is science and culture, but the focus is always the human beings, right? Because that's sort of like the most fascinating. Is where we bring the most, that's where we see the real repercussions of this absolutely fascinating technology. So Alice is somebody who tests. Her name is Alice Collins Playbook. She is raised in a large Irish Catholic family with a very strong sense of Irish identity on both sides. And she's a genealogist, and she's retired by the time we meet her in 2012. And she's doing DNA because, she wants to break through some of those brick walls that genealogists are always trying to break through. And DNA is a great way to do that. And she's just looking for a little more information about, counties in Ireland where her dad's family might have come from, that sort of thing. And she takes this test, and the ethnicity estimate that she gets from the company is, which is Ancestry DNA, is completely unexpected. The ethnicity estimate tells her that she is not almost entirely Irish American. In fact, she's half Ashkenazi Jewish, which is Jews from Central and Eastern Europe who have a unique genetic signature that's quite different from someone who's descended from ancestors who come from who lived in Ireland. And of course, she at first thinks that this ethnicity estimate is flawed. And that, the test is kind of early days for this type of testing, and Ancestry has just started offering their ancestry DNA test. So, that makes sense as an assumption, but it's not the right one. She discovers, like many people who are to follow, that the company is right, and that it is she who has her own story so wrong. And she launches herself on this detective journey. It's kind of a whodunit, right? And the whodunit is herself. She's trying to figure out, how she got it wrong. That takes 2.5 years. And this really painstaking work. So the reason I think Alice's story is really compelling is because it's a very surprising explanation. She explores all this sort of more standard explanations for unexpected ancestry. So she explores the possibility that she's not related to her dad, a phenomenon that's known sometimes by the term NPE, for non-paternity event. She explores and is able to dismiss the possibility that she is adopted, that she's donor conceived, or that she comes from a community of people who hid their genetic ancestry for historical reasons, like trying to escape from discrimination. And eventually comes to understand that the real explanation is very unusual and goes back 100 years. But what I love about using that story as the kind of central thread of the Lost Family is that I then can tell so many other stories within it, right? I can tell stories of people experiencing non-paternity events, people who were told that they were donor conceived, because of the stigma 60, 70 years ago when they were born. People who were adopted and not told about it. And indeed, people who came from communities like light-skinned African Americans who chose to pass to escape rampant discrimination and then didn't tell their children, or the knowledge was gradually erased or forgotten or left out. And those children are just discovering those revelations right now through DNA testing.
Ugh. Let's go to that idea of the NPEs, the non-paternity events. You find, you're not related to, the parent you thought was, your biological parent. Is that, and that's something that when you're seeking more information, it affects not only you and your biological parent, it can affect sort of their families, changing their stories. Can you talk about maybe how common it is for people to come across this and how people respond in these cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. Within the universe of DNA surprises, the discovery that you're not related to your dad is one of the most common. It's probably in the low single digits, just under 2% based on the best studies that I've seen. And that's actually quite a lot of people because of the number of people who've tested. So, if you take that along with the possibility of discovering a previously unknown genetic half-sibling, which is those are the two most common scenarios. If that's, conservatively speaking, 3%, which is the number I arrived at after I interviewed and looked at research from genetic genealogists and population geneticists. If it's just 3%, that's well over 1 million people. And that's because of the 37 million people who have taken a DNA test. So, it's just, again, it's statistics, right? Even if it's a relatively small number, because so many people are engaged in the technology, that's a lot of consumers discovering one of those two most common scenarios. But the impact is actually quite a bit greater than that. And that is because, each single revelation refracts across a lot of people, right? And many of those people are not in the databases. So if I take a test and I discover I'm not genetically related to dad, well, that doesn't just have an impact on me. It has an impact on my relationship with him, right? And potentially his relationship with my mom, right? And now they're going to have some really painful conversations and it may not go well. And now I'm discovering my siblings are actually, wow, genetically speaking, they're my half siblings. And there is a man 10 minutes away or 2 states away who is my genetic father. And I may want to know him and I may want to reach out to him. And now that's going to prompt revelations and moment of reckoning for him and his wife and his children, who I am now discovering are my half siblings as well. So, you're talking about many millions of Americans impacted in this moment by DNA testing. And the ways that people respond are really varied. And that was one of the things that I wanted to explore in The Lost Family, telling a lot of these stories in 360 form. What happens when, what is behind it when a man is reached out to and he deletes his kit and refuses contact, right? Or I have in the book a story of a man who sends his daughter a lawyer's letter, right? He asked his lawyer to write her a letter saying, basically, stop contacting me. And then you hear stories that are quite warm and moving, where the family, because of the culture of the family or the circumstances of the man in question, is able to embrace that child. And maybe it's not seamless, but it is possible. And in fact, in the book, I try to tell like both types of stories, right? It's not all I think a lot of newspaper stories tend to be a bit overly positive because there's like these reunions and then everything's tied up with a bow and you leave the people there, right? And in fact, it's almost always more complicated than that. So I tried to tell the stories where it doesn't work out well and the stories where it does, because I think those are really hopeful. All right, and those kind of point the way forward because this phenomenon is certainly not going away. And I have actually, if you're down with it, I have a short reading from the story of a non-paternity event that actually has quite a lovely and kind of inspirational ending, if you will.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I'm gonna minimize myself, but yes, let's That's wonderful.
And I should say, these stories don't end in many ways. They keep going. And I think that they probably will go on for some people for the rest of their lives because they invite a complete rethinking and rewriting of one's family, one's identity. So this is from a chapter in The Lost Family called Non-Paternity Events that just explores the phenomenon of non-paternity events. Who decides what story we get to tell? Countless American men have by now been contacted and told that they helped make a child once and that those children would now like to introduce themselves. Some knew this day might come, others never imagined it. Many more will face this reckoning in years to come. And then there are men who find out the children they raised are not their own. Quote, sometimes it's hard because she reminds me of what my ex did, one man told the Atlantic magazine, referring to the girl he now knows is not his genetic daughter. The revelation led to his divorce. Genetic counselor Brianne Kirkpatrick, who has started her own private Facebook groups for people who've experienced DNA surprises, had a client who discovered at the age of 78 that neither of his children was genetically his. He was pissed, Kirkpatrick says. He wondered if he could sue his ex-wife. But just as you can't anticipate what you'll discover when you test, you can't predict how the person on the other side of that test will react. I emailed with a man named Jeff Lester in Lebanon, Missouri, who told me that the discovery of a daughter he'd unknowingly conceived at the age of 16 was a miracle. She'd matched him on Ancestry DNA during a period when he'd put his genealogical work on hold, so he never saw her messages there. Instead, she eventually messaged him on Facebook. Jeff told me he thought at first that this was a scam. He was 50 years old, and he did not remember getting any girlfriends pregnant back in high school. But he logged on to Ancestry, and there she was, this girl. No, this woman, already 32 years old, already a mother herself, listed among his matches as his daughter. Jeff told me he could not get over the unlikeliness of his daughter finding him. Outside of DNA testing, it almost certainly would not have happened. She had been given up for adoption when she was a baby and did not know the identity of either of her biological parents. When Jeff helped her uncover her mother's identity, she turned out to be someone with whom he'd had a brief relationship he didn't remember consummating. It sounds like a bad after-school special, he wrote me. The other piece of the miracle, Jeff said, was that he was not supposed to be alive. He'd been diagnosed in his 20s with ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, and had been on a ventilator for 2 decades. With this sword of Damocles hanging over him, he'd built a life for himself, marrying and having 3 wonderful daughters. He was astonished that he'd not only outlived the odds, but lived long enough to discover that, in fact, he had 4 daughters, plus a son-in-law and grandchildren. He felt the hand of God at work. He told me all this over email and Facebook Messenger, typing by way of a wireless, head-controlled mouse attached to his glasses because the ALS severely limited his ability to speak. Jeff told me he was determined to live as fully as he could while he was still on this earth. He had forged a relationship with his oldest daughter, and he and his wife even got to host the grandchildren for a sleepover. He did not feel guilty or ashamed about her existence. Those were wasteful emotions, and his disease had taught him that none of us have time to waste. Under the shadow of imminent mortality, he said, quote, "You focus more on what is truly important in life." For Jeff, the unexpected outcome of recreational DNA testing simply meant more love. And that's just a little taste of that chapter on non-paternity events.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love that. It's interesting in the various stories that you have in there, whether they're kind of happy or surprised, it's a positive event, a negative event. But for some people, getting these results give them a sense of sort of like a feeling of like settling in like what they, it's like, yes, I knew this to be true. It is now proven by my genes. But then for other people, it's, they maybe get a surprise and they're like, well, my genes don't mean anything. It's I know who I am. I know what my family is. And you used a quote from philosopher Francois Baylis. I think the phrase was an ongoing social negotiation that comes in when you're trying to situate yourself in this. Can you talk about the idea of like what happens when like your family history and your family narrative collide, like what you're expecting, what you know, versus what your genes are telling you and what that means or what that can mean to you?
Yeah. So the thing I found earlier is that people they define these revelations and the significance of them for themselves. Whether you're talking about revelations of family or you're talking about revelations of ethnicity or both, right? So there's this central question. Let's say you are let's say you're Alice, right? And you're in your 60s and you've been raised to believe that you're Irish your entire life, and you're discovering that you're half Ashkenazi Jewish. Does that alter you, or are you just still Irish? Because the totality of your experience, putting aside the genes, is this one thing, right? And that's where the emotion is, that's where the love is, that's where the intention comes from, her parents having put in all this work and effort into forging and celebrating their Irish identity. And on the other hand, depending on the circumstances that denied you your genetic identity, if you want to use that term, could you deny that? Right? Can you ignore that? And what's interesting about the Collins family, so Alice is one of 7 siblings. And one of the things I was interested in, and I get to this towards the end of The Lost Family, is this question of, okay, so are you Jewish? Are you Irish? Are you both? Like, to what extent do you identify now, knowing not only about your DNA, but the explanation for your unexpected genetic ancestry? To what extent do you identify with your Jewish identity, spiritually, ethnically, culturally, however you want to define it? And everyone answers it differently. Everyone in the Collins family answers it differently, right? And I say in the book, it's a question with a 7-sided answer. Part of it, I think Alice and her sister, who are the folks who are primarily the most invested in the journey, and they're the ones who do the hard work day after day, they are much more invested in their Jewish identity than most of their brothers. They have 5 brothers. And I couldn't tell you why, right? Some of that is his childhood experiences. Some of it might be the investment of time. Some of it is their spirit of genealogical inquiry and their connection with cousins, right? So you see this over and over again, right? This people defining it for themselves based on questions they did or didn't have. A lot of folks told me that when they discovered that they weren't who they thought, as they would put it, that it was like, oh, of course, right? Even if they never admitted to themselves that they had questions, looking back, they had a sense of otherness in their own family. They had a sense of disconnection from a relative. They had a feeling that a certain thing that their mother had said when they were 6 years old was a strange thing for her to have said that had never made sense and now was put in context. There was a woman named Ricky who I interviewed who's actually a geneticist herself. She's written about DNA testing and DNA testing surprises, and she had been writing about them shortly before she got her own surprise. So she was so intimately familiar with the landscape of surprises, but again, never thought it would happen to her because, again, as I was saying earlier, people don't. And it turned out that she was donor conceived and that she had, I think, 6 or 7 half siblings, as she would ultimately discover. And she described to me something that other people also described, which was like waking up in the middle of the night with old memories that she had not unearthed in decades, things she had literally never thought of, that now she was remembering, and they were suddenly put into new context. So I think of it as like the book of your life, and you've now just put an asterisk next to everything, and you've annotated it, and you've said, but wait, right? This is a completely different context to that thing that happened in 1988. And for a lot of people, I think it does invite a kind of, particularly if you're discovering something about one of your parents, like a parent's identity, right? That maybe you weren't genetically related to both your parents. I think for most people, it really does invite a profound rethinking of who you are and does mean a great deal. On the other hand, for people who have a revelation that goes back a few generations, it might not be that big of a deal because it's just as distant. It's not as emotionally impactful.
Sure. And, we know that, on sort of the positive side of DNA testing, there are many cases where there maybe is no paper trail, in cases of, there's our history of slavery. There may have been, various wars that changed borders, paperwork was lost, even natural disasters, things can be lost. But so in those cases, DNA can be, a great service to find those things, but it can also then, again, in something like the case of slavery, lead to, just really tough questions, either, learning things about ancestors that, are very uncomfortable to learn, or can be in some ways not positive, but can clarify things for you. Can you talk more about maybe that aspect and what you've discovered?
Yeah, I mean, the genes are truth tellers, right? We provide the context for them, and DNA testing and isolation without the help of paper records doesn't going to tell you much, right? So a lot of genetic genealogists will say you can't use the DNA in isolation. You have to be a genealogist as well. It's interesting for particularly like the African American community. If you are looking at a community that has historically been has historically not had very much power, they tend not to have records, right? Records tend to coalesce around power. And so if you come from a community that was people were illiterate, people didn't have access to paper, they didn't have reliable means of keeping records. They weren't written about because they weren't named, because they weren't considered important enough. How the heck are you supposed to do the genealogical research and know who you are? So it's like a double disenfranchisement. So if you look at the African American community, it's like, let's say you're trying to trace your ancestor and you're looking at the federal census and you've got them, all the way, going back decade after decade through the 20th century. You are going to hit a brick wall if you try to go back before the 1870 federal census, because once your ancestors were enslaved, they were no longer named. And so you're going to hit a block. They're not to say there aren't other resources that you can go to and they might help you, but it's a real stumbling block for a lot of people. And I write in the book about a couple of African-American genealogists who are able to use DNA to get around that. And it's absolutely amazing, right? One of them is able to find a present day cousin who's living in Africa. So this is a man who's related to him from before the transatlantic slave trade. And there's a siren going by my house. I don't know if you can hear that, but it's a beautiful background. So, he is able to then connect with this cousin, and this cousin says, let me tell you about the community that our people come from. They come from a community of people known as the Fulani. And this African-American genealogist is like, boom, are you serious? I can look this up. And he, Googles the Fulani, and he is able to see customs, foods, migration patterns, like where they lived, how they lived. Like, what a gift, right? To be able to access all that information. On the other hand, history is very, very ugly in many cases. And I think a lot of African Americans know that. I think it's actually often white Americans who have been able to live in denial about that. If you are African American and your ancestors lived through slavery, about the legacy of rape between white masters and the women that were enslaved by them, and you may assume that may have marked your genealogical line. And I think for a lot of white Americans, that's something that they are basically privileged enough to not have to think about, but really they should. And so, there's a couple of fascinating, avenues of research that are going on right now. In particular, I watched a talk recently between an African-American genealogist and a white genealogist who are related, and they are related through the same, white slave owner. And they got together and they pooled their resources and they figured out how to research, the white family and the Black family and all of how they descended and came together, right? And that kind of, I think DNA gives us, and genealogy and together, and in particular, they give us this opportunity to be more clear-eyed about our history. And I do think that is an opportunity that we should be taking. I think it's a good thing for us to look back and see it as it really was, and not perhaps look away for it or see it as we wish it might have been.
Yeah, definitely. It's amazing to, as much as DNA is great for these like genealogical discoveries for identifying, parts of your past and your family story. It's big into how it's being used now in additional ways. I recently got a notification from Fold3, which is an Ancestry affiliate, that they're putting out a call. There was the 92nd Infantry Division was the only Black infantry division to see combat in Europe in World War II. And I think 50 or so members are still unaccounted for. So they're putting out calls for people who might have been related to submit DNA information to try and identify those people. So like that's one way it's being used. But then we're seeing it also in something like the case of the Golden State Killer, where access to publicly available genealogical database yielded results. And then, which, great to catch a killer. But then there's also then ensuing discussion still ongoing about what that means for privacy, who has access to what, do you opt in, do you opt out? What can that mean? Can you talk more about kind of that topic around, privacy and the other uses of genealogical data?
Yeah. We've always had law enforcement DNA databases, not always, but we've had them for quite some time. And yet the kind of DNA that is information that is stored there is different from what's available in consumer DNA testing databases. The DNA testing databases are much richer as a source of information. It's much more easy to do what's known as like a long-range familial search, which is to say matching one person with their third or fourth cousin. And that is the underpinnings of the mechanism for identifying the Golden State Killer, and all the cases, and probably one estimate 200 have followed, that have been solved, or there's been a meaningful tip in them from DNA since that time, in the 2.5 years since the Golden State Killer. So what's interesting to know is that the techniques for identifying people who are not in the database have been there for at least 10 years. They were used primarily and pioneered by members of the adoptee community and search angels working with them to help them identify their birth parents in instances where they lived in states where they didn't have access to their original birth certificates. So all those kind of questions around the power of DNA, the absolute richness of the type of DNA that these companies are studying, and questions around privacy, those were all kind of there. But it wasn't until law enforcement, decided to try to access these databases and use these techniques to identify a murderer, that it kind of became something that more Americans knew about. And it is in many ways transforming how cold cases are solved. I mean, it's mostly cold cases, at least for the moment. These are cases, it's, 1970s, 1960s, 1950s. I've even seen cases go further back than that are now being solved because of this. So it's absolutely incredible, right? And as you said, like pretty good to get that guy off the street, right? And at the same time, there's no official sort of laws around how this is used. It kind of emerged, like many things in this industry, emerged and just started running really fast down the road, and regulators kind of like look up and say, wait, what? We're always kind of, with new technologies in general, regulation is always very behind. And so there's no guardrails in place right now for how this is used. When is it not used? Are there certain crimes that are too small or too troubling for us to use DNA for? And if the price of it continues to go down, is there going to be a temptation to use it in cases that maybe people aren't comfortable with? It hasn't been robustly tested in court. So there's these questions about like, what would happen if it were really tested? Would these techniques hold up? And so there's a lot of unanswered questions about this, but for the moment, it's not slowing down.
Sure. I was interested too. You had a couple examples in there in your book about essentially, I think you called them citizen scientists, people who had been search angels or genetic genealogists that, have become experts in this field of making these connections, these patterns, but there's not like a training program per se for that work, other than spending all of that time.
Right.
yourself in these types of cases. So that'll be, yeah, a fascinating thing to keep up with as it changes. I do have more questions, but I want to make sure that we have any audience questions. We have time to answer those. I know we have one at the moment, and I will encourage you all to please add more to the pile. You talked about this a little bit, and this is something that you cover in the book, but we have a question. If you could please discuss the effects of discovery that a sperm donor had genetically fathered hundreds of children rather than the limited number approved by sperm banks. There was the case of at least one fertility doctor who was involved in this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there are many, I shouldn't say many, there are quite a number of fertility doctors who it has been discovered substituted in their own sperm in place of other sperm donors who had been requested by families. And they didn't tell the parents. So that has led, in fact, to a number of fertility fraud laws being passed in state after state to make this sort of thing illegal because it's not. And one of the fascinating things about DNA testing as a technology is to look how it has collided with and revealed the practices of another technology, which is the fertility industry. People, not everyone may know that, in fact, there are no legal limits on the number of children that one donor can conceive in the United States. So what does that mean? It means that, and sometimes the record keeping isn't great. And sometimes a sperm donor is donating, say, in a mid-sized city, and their children know each other and are interacting and are may wind up college roommates, may wind up classmates, may wind up buddies with their half siblings without knowing it. And so that is, for a lot of people within the donor conceived world, very problematic. And it's also the case that that there are these sprawling genetic networks that we know of between 100 and 200 half siblings that we know of. But estimates are that some of these families may be, greater than that, because again, there's no legal limits.
Right.
So, I do think that DNA testing is in some ways potentially forcing the hand of the fertility industry, because it is revealing things that I think a lot of people, when you don't know about it and you don't see the repercussions of it, that DNA has laid bare, you can't kind of grapple with it. There's a lot of things that historically have happened in the fertility industry, going back to its beginnings, frankly, its very beginnings, that by modern standards would be considered unethical and not within the realm of what, a doctor should do. So space, I think it's absolutely fascinating, the collision of DNA and the fertility industry and the rise of fertility fraud laws is a really fascinating legal development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing how, I guess, over the past 10 years, if everybody read the book, you'll see in Alice's journey, just from year to year, the changes in what technology allows, what results can give you, changes so quickly. And even now, we're into it now, but it's still so much is still changing. So much is still so unknown. It's an incredible thing.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to say that, when I started writing this book in 2017, there were 8 million people in the databases. Or at least 8 million DNA test kits sold. There's a little bit of overlap for people like me who've tested in more than one place. And now there are 37 million DNA test kits sold. And that effectively means, and most of them are Americans, by the way, that effectively means that the majority of Americans are effectively opted into this technology, even if they don't choose to test. And that's because, everyone who's watching, your genetic segments are already in the databases, right? Your genetic information, because by dint of the fact that a third or a second cousin has tested and is already in there, and probably a closer relation, right? So in some sense, you're opted in. Not testing may still have, if you're concerned about issues like certain kinds of privacy, like genetic discrimination, which I talk about in the book, not testing may offer you some protections. But in terms of the privacy of the family, that you really don't get to maintain that whatever you choose in some ways. And that's because people who are not in the databases are potentially identifiable. to people who are related to them and looking for them. And because even if you haven't tested, you may still be materially affected by a revelation having to do with your family or your own health because of the decision of somebody else to test. So that means that we're ushering in this new kind of era of transparency, right, and greater discussion about, the practices of the past and all the things we weren't told about the way children came into the world, as stigmas that, maybe they seem kind of passé, but, you can feel their effects even now in the fact that people don't know who they are, because they weren't told. And there's definitely a yin yang to it. I mean, there's families that have been really disintegrated by this. And also there's an incredible gift for a lot of people in being able to find one another before your parents die, for instance. And the vast majority of people who I've interviewed who discovered something surprising about their own genetic origins, even when it was painful, they said they were glad to know, because we place such a premium on just knowing the truth, right? Knowing the true context for your life is just a deeply meaningful thing.
Absolutely. And something that I did want to have you talk about, which I'm going to try and pair with this question that just came in, is as these discoveries are being made, people's families are changing and growing in various ways. Either it's, maybe there's like a long lost cousin you didn't know from maybe there was an aunt or uncle who was adopted out. And so you have family that you didn't know you had, or something like, again, like a parent, a biological parent that you didn't know was out in the world somewhere, and how that kind of changes what like a basic family looks like, all of these offshoots. And then we had a question from the audience about talking about the NPE communities that have grown up. So if you can kind of, sorry, I'll make you push them together, but sort of as these, again, sort of like offshoots of what we think of as like a basic nuclear family have changed. How does that work, especially again in these like NPE communities?
Yeah. I mean, I think we've always had kind of the reality of how families are made, and maybe the idealized version of how families are made, and we've never conformed to the cultural ideal, right? Even some would suggest that we don't believe that it is the ideal, right? But I think the DNA age kind of forces recognition of all the different ways that a family can be formed, and all the different ways that it can be shaped, and the relationships that can exist beyond sometimes terminology, right? We don't always have the language for the man who contributed half my genetic material,
Sure, but
is not my dad because I have a dad, right? We don't have the language for that, but I think we're going to have to figure out the language for that because of this moment of genetic reckoning that we're in. The question about NPE communities is a great one. That's one of the most robust things that you're seeing coming out of this moment of DNA surprises is the number of people who've discovered they're not genetically related to their dad, and they're coming together. So they're coming together in Facebook groups. There's a lot of Facebook groups. There's a number of advocacy or educational organizations. So one is called NPE Friends Fellowship. Another one is called Right to Know. And these are organizations that are dedicated to like advocating for the rights of people, of NPEs, to like know their own genetic identities and educate people about, the situations that they're in. And then in addition to that, there's this group of psychologists who have emerged to treat people who are discovering that they are NPEs. And I think every single one of them except one, and I've talked to a lot of these psychologists who have emerged, and every one of them but one came to this work because they took a DNA test and they found out that they themselves were an NPE, and they realized that this was a specialty. And you will hear people who have discovered they're an NPE, gone to a therapist and said, that therapist stinks. She really didn't understand. She suggested that this didn't really matter, that my dad was still my dad, and why are you making such a big deal about it? And it is a very specific experience, and it really benefits people who want to turn to, they want professional mental health help. Really benefits them to see somebody who really gets the contours of this specific NPE experience, because it's a really meaningful thing. It's not something you can brush off and say, what does it matter? And so, yeah, I hope that helps answer the question of NPE communities, which are really flourishing right now.
Wonderful. So I'm sorry. So we have another question. If we can clarify what we mean by NPE.
Sure. So NPE historically stood for the term non-paternity event. More recently, it's been taken to, the definition is not parent expected. And basically what that means is you take a DNA test or through some other means, you discover that one or both parents is not genetically related to you, typically your dad. Sometimes people call it an MPE for misattributed parentage experience. So there are a lot of terms, but they all basically mean that same thing.
Thank you. It's a new language that has to sort of form around this topic.
Yeah.
We're getting closer to the end. I don't want to. Oh, good. We have another question right here. I was going to say I have some other ones. We have a question. I think a lot of times in the NPE discussions, there's, you finding out your father is not your father. Are there ever, can you talk about any cases where someone finds out their mother is not their mother? Is there maybe in cases of egg donation, or where in previous years where mothers raised their daughter's children as their own, or siblings, or mother and daughter?
Yeah, I haven't done enough interviews in this space to talk about that as a specific own experience. But that does happen for a variety of reasons. As you say, cases of egg donation. Some people would consider like cases of previously undisclosed adoption to be an NPE situation. So, I write in the book about a woman named Linda who doesn't know that she is adopted until she takes a DNA test when she's 51 years old. So she's discovering basically two misattributed parentage experiences in one blow. She's neither related to her mom nor to her dad, genetically speaking. And, there are other stories. I've interviewed people who discovered that the people they thought of as their parents were actually their grandparents. And that, the woman they thought of as an aunt, for instance, was actually their mom. So there's definitely, different flavors of types of misattributed parentage experiences. I think the non-paternity event version of it, where you find out it's about not being genetically related to dad, that's the most common. And so those tend to be like the dominant storylines, but by no means is it limited to those experiences.
Sure. So we have another question. Are there different groups who address the different ways in which one could become an NPE? So I guess that's for maybe people who are like just coming in to understanding this as maybe their personal reality. So is there sort of like I think they're asking if there's like a starting point to get into these different groups, understanding the different paths that may have led to NPE.
Yeah, I mean, potentially. I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but I will say if it kind of like just want a starting point, I would go to two websites. One is NPE Friends Fellowship. I'm going to drop it in the chat. Hang on a second here. NPE Friends Fellowship. And I'm misspelling in my haste. And the other is Right to Know. And oops, there we go. And so both of those groups are advocacy and educational organizations. And if you go on to Right to Know, for instance, they feature stories of people with their NPE experiences. There's different contours to those stories, right? So that could be like a kind of a good place to start. There's a lot of Facebook groups, and I don't want to, mention some and omit others, but just off the top of my head, because I was looking in the group today, there's an organization called like the Mindful NPE, for instance. And you could check on Facebook for them. There's also something called, I'm just going to write this, the MPE for Misattributed Parenting Experience Counseling Collective. And that's a group of therapists who specialize in the NPE/MPE. It's the same thing, just different terminology. That experience they specialize in treating. So those are some sort of resources to get you started if you're having this experience, you're interested in this topic.
That's great. I hope that we answered the question correctly, and that's a great one too, because I know we're talking also about either donor parents or but then there are, I think, there are also those cases where for various reasons there may have been trauma involved, and if in cases of maybe rape or something
Oh,
where
absolutely.
you may still get that answer, but and so the discovery, really counseling is a
Absolutely.
great resource for that.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
um, so are there I think we've covered a lot of topics, but is there anything else that, like, if someone's getting the gift of a home DNA test, this Mother's Day or Father's Day, anything they should know before they take that leap? Anything we haven't discussed that they should know?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the advice I tend to give these days, because again, we're all sort of like affected by this technology, even if we haven't tested, is in some ways for the older generation, right? Because I think a lot of these family secrets are going to come out. It's a matter of time. Even if you don't test, a sibling tests, a child tests, a cousin tests, there are various kinds of things that come out that can impact you even if you've stayed, far away from it. So certainly not testing can kind of slow that process down. And if you're maybe feeling a little uneasy about delving too deep, by all means, maybe hold off. Um, and know also that it can be like a tremendously amazing kind of journey of self-discovery, right? It's so hard to predict what you're going to get before you test. But my advice is often to the older generation that if you are in possession of knowledge about one of your children, about the way they came into the world that maybe isn't what they know, it might be time to think about having that conversation with them, because the other possibility is that one day they find out from taking a test and maybe you're not around to have that conversation, and that can be deeply painful. It's almost always better to hear it from the lips of someone who loves you,
Sure.
than to get it because they get that information because you took a DNA test.
When you did your DNA test, I know you're obviously a journalist and you're doing this research. Did you have any concerns about if there was something that you would have to then share with your family that you found?
I didn't, because by the time I took a test, both my parents had tested, my brother had tested, and I felt like in some ways it was vetted, right? If we were going to find something, I suppose there always is the possibility of something, a secret that was like limited to me, but I guess like everyone else, I assumed that it wouldn't apply to me, and I happened to be part of the cohort for whom it did not, right? But I have to say, like, we've made so many genealogical discoveries now in terms of connecting with people and understanding where we came from, and finding long lost relatives that we were separated because of emigration and poverty and war and all this stuff, that I I feel very blessed, frankly. I feel like the lesson to me is that, the past isn't over, right? It lives inside of us. And so we happen to be in this moment where, for good and for bad, depending on your circumstances, and it's deeply nuanced and complicated, we can go on this kind of journey of understanding ourselves through the past. And at least for my family, that's been kind of a really rich thing. But I know that really can vary from individual and family to family.
Yeah, absolutely. I would again encourage everyone to check out the book. I'm going to put in the chat again. If you are interested in getting signed and personalized copies, you can contact Libby's local indie, the Village Bookstore in Pleasantville, to access those. We have one more technical question that someone just added. If you don't mind answering, if you could answer the question of if full siblings have the same exact profiles.
Great question. I'm going to answer that. I'm also popping into the chat my newsletter if people want to sign up for it, where I write a regular column. I'll send it out. Sometimes I do book giveaways. So if you want to sign up, you can. Do full siblings have the same exact DNA profiles? They do not, because siblings inherit different things from their parents. So, sometimes, you may get a little more of the Italian and your sibling gets a little more of the Swedish. And that is, that is something that's hard to understand, but it is the case, and it has to do with the way that that DNA is passed down and recombined. And once you know that, then it's not so startling. But they shouldn't vary wildly, right? And one thing to just keep in mind as you look at your results is that your DNA relative matching, the DNA relative matching, where you get somebody in the system the company has identified as related to you because you and they shared overlapping genetic segments. That system of predicting relatives is very robust and very reliable. The ethnicity estimates, which tell you how Italian and Swedish you are not as reliable because they are estimates. They will vary from company to company, and they will continually evolve as the company gets better at making those predictions. So take the one with a grain of salt, but know that the relatives are very reliable. And that's an important thing to keep in mind and distinguish between them when you take that test.
Awesome. Okay, we'll sneak in this one more, and then that'll be the end.
Okay.
But can a child ever have more than 50% DNA from one parent?
My understanding is that it is 50%, but there's often on the margins people arguing about the size of the X chromosome versus the Y. So I won't go into the technical bit, if only because then I'm not sure that I will be on solid ground. But
there's research out there that they can.
The easy answer is you inherit 50% from each parent, and yeah, basically that is what you should expect when you're looking at your DNA results from one of these major companies.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been really fascinating. I think we're seeing in the chat, we've got a lot of people saying how interesting and how exciting this program is. So really, thank you for joining us. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
We hope that everybody in attendance will check that out. And to please check out Libby's website and join her newsletter and find out more about her and the work she's doing. We will say farewell again. Just remember that this has been recorded. So if somebody missed it tonight that you think would like to check out this program, please send it to them. We'd love to get more people to know about the book and about the DNA testing as well. So thank you again. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you so much. Bye.